Before we begin this incredible story, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss another amazing story like this one. The morning sun painted the military training ground in shades of gold and amber. Sarah Mitchell stood at the entrance gate, her visitor pass clutched tightly in her sweaty palm. She was just a journalist, here to write a simple feature story about women in the military. Nothing more, nothing less. Her editor had given her this assignment 3 days ago, telling her it would be an easy piece about modern military life. Sarah had no military background, no experience with weapons, and certainly no interest in anything more dangerous than her morning coffee. The base was massive, stretching across hundreds of acres of dusty terrain. Soldiers moved with purpose across the grounds, their boots creating small clouds of dust with each step. Sarah felt completely out of place in her civilian clothes, carrying only her notebook and camera. She had dressed professionally, but practically. Wearing comfortable jeans and a plain shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Everything about her screamed civilian. Captain James Rodriguez was supposed to be her guide for the day. He was a tall man with kind eyes and a firm handshake. When he met Sarah at the gate, he seemed genuinely happy to show a reporter around. He explained that the military was trying to improve its public image. Stories like hers helped people understand what soldiers really did. Sarah nodded politely, already planning her questions in her head. They walked through various sections of the base. Captain Rodriguez showed her the barracks, the mess hall, and the training facilities. Sarah took notes dutifully, asking questions about daily routines and soldier life. Everything was going according to plan. It was all very ordinary, very safe, very predictable. She was already thinking about how she would structure her article, maybe lead with a quote from one of the female soldiers she had interviewed. Then they arrived at the shooting range. The sound of gunfire echoed across the open space, sharp cracks that made Sarah flinch despite the ear protection the captain had given her. Soldiers lay on their stomachs in neat rows, firing at targets hundreds of meters away. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air, acrid and strange to Sarah's untrained nose. She had never been this close to real weapons before, Captain. Rodriguez was explaining something about marksmanship training when Sergeant Lisa Chen approached them. She was a petite woman with sharp features and an intense gaze. She was carrying something long and heavy, wrapped in a protective case. Sarah later learned it was a Barrett M82 sniper rifle, one of the most powerful long-range weapons in the military arsenal. But at that moment, she had no idea what she was looking at. The sergeant was speaking quickly to Captain Rodriguez, something about a demonstration that was scheduled for visiting military officials. Apparently, their designated marksman had called in sick that morning. They needed someone to at least show the officials how the weapon was set up, even if they couldn't do a live demonstration. It was supposed to be a simple showcase of equipment, nothing more. Then something strange happened. Sergeant Chen looked at Sarah, really looked at her, studying her stance and build. Sarah felt uncomfortable under that intense gaze, wondering what the sergeant was thinking. Captain Rodriguez seemed confused too, asking Chen what she had in mind. The sergeant said something that would change everything. She suggested that Sarah could hold the rifle for the demonstration, just as a stand-in. Just to show the officials what it looked like when someone was in shooting position. Sarah's first instinct was to refuse. She had never held a gun in her life. She didn't know anything about military weapons. She was just a journalist, for heaven's sake. But Captain Rodriguez seemed to think it was a harmless idea. He assured her she wouldn't have to actually shoot anything. She would just lie down, hold the rifle, and let the officials see what the setup looked like. It would take 5 minutes, maybe less. Against her better judgment. Sarah agreed. Sergeant Chen led Sarah to a shooting position at the far end of the range. The ground was hard and uncomfortable, covered with a thin mat that did little to cushion against the packed earth beneath. Sarah knelt down awkwardly, not sure how she was supposed to position herself. The sergeant patiently showed her the proper stance, how to lie flat with her legs spread slightly for balance, how to tuck the rifle stock against her shoulder. The weapon was heavier than Sarah had imagined. When Sergeant Chen placed it in her hands, she was surprised by the cold metal and the solid weight of it. This wasn't like the plastic toys she had seen in movies. This was real, powerful, designed for a very specific and deadly purpose. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the weapon, trying to remember everything the sergeant was telling her. Captain Rodriguez stood nearby with a group of visiting military officials. They were high-ranking officers from allied nations, here to observe American military training methods. They watched with polite interest as this civilian woman tried to position herself correctly. Some of them smiled, probably amused by the sight of a journalist playing soldier for a few minutes. None of them expected what was about to happen. Sergeant Chen was explaining the rifle's capabilities to the officials. She talked about its range, its accuracy, its ability to hit targets at extreme distances. Sarah wasn't really listening. She was too focused on trying to look like she knew what she was doing, trying not to embarrass herself in front of all these professional soldiers. She adjusted her position slightly, trying to get comfortable. Then something strange happened. As Sarah looked through the scope, something clicked in her mind. The world seemed to narrow down to just what she could see through that small circle of glass. Everything else faded away. The noise of the range, the voices of the officials, even her own nervousness. It all just disappeared. She could see the target clearly, a small shape far down the range. Without thinking, she adjusted her position slightly, feeling the rifle settle into place against her shoulder. Sergeant Chen noticed the change immediately. She stopped talking and watched Sarah with sudden interest. The way Sarah was holding the rifle. The way she had naturally found the correct breathing pattern. The way her body had instinctively relaxed into the proper shooting stance. It was unusual for someone with no training. The sergeant exchanged a glance with Captain Rodriguez, who looked equally surprised. One of the visiting officials asked if the journalist would actually fire the weapon. He said it jokingly, not expecting anyone to take him seriously. But Sergeant Chen didn't laugh. Instead, she looked at Sarah and asked if she wanted to try taking a shot. Just one shot, just to see what it felt like. Sarah should have said no. She should have stood up, handed back the rifle, and returned to her safe, predictable journalism job. But she didn't. Something in her wanted to know if she could do it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was something else entirely, something she didn't understand herself. She heard herself say yes, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. The officials perked up with interest. This might actually be entertaining, watching a civilian try to shoot a military sniper rifle. Sergeant Chen gave Sarah quick instructions about the trigger, about breathing, about patience. She told Sarah not to expect to hit anything. The target was 800 meters away, a difficult shot even for trained soldiers. Sarah was just a civilian with no experience. The point was just to let her feel what it was like to fire the weapon, nothing more. Nobody expected her to actually hit the target. Sarah settled back into position. She looked through the scope again, finding that strange, quiet place in her mind where everything else disappeared. She could feel her heartbeat, steady and slow. She took a breath, let half of it out, and held. Her finger found the trigger. She didn't think about what she was doing. She didn't analyze or plan. She just felt the moment felt when everything aligned. And gently squeezed, the rifle kicked against her shoulder with tremendous force. The sound was deafening even through her ear protection. Sarah blinked, temporarily disoriented by the recoil and the noise. For a moment, nobody said anything. They were all watching the target through their binoculars and scopes, waiting to see where the bullet had gone. Most first-time shooters missed by meters, their shots landing in the dirt, far from the target. Then Sergeant Chen lowered her binoculars, her face showing complete shock. Sarah had hit the target dead center. Not just hit it, but placed the shot in the exact middle of the bullseye. At 800 meters, with no training, no experience, and no preparation, the officials crowded around the spotting scopes, confirming what they were seeing. There was no mistake. The civilian journalist had just made a shot that would have been impressive for a trained marksman. Captain Rodriguez didn't know what to say. He had seen thousands of soldiers go through marksmanship training over his career. He had never seen anything like this. Beginner's luck, he told himself. It had to be. There was no other explanation that made sense. But even as he thought it, he knew that luck didn't explain the way Sarah had positioned herself. the way she had controlled her breathing, the natural steadiness of her hands. Sergeant Chen had a different look in her eyes. She had been a marksmanship instructor for 7 years. She knew talent when she saw it. This wasn't luck. This was something rare, something special. She asked Sarah if she wanted to try again. Sarah, still stunned by what had just happened, nodded slowly. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally hitting her system. But when she settled back into position behind the rifle, the shaking stopped. The second target was set at 1,000 meters. This was a distance where wind, temperature, and even the curvature of the earth started to matter. Trained snipers spent years learning to make accurate shots at this range. They studied ballistics, practiced constantly, learned to read environmental conditions like expert meteorologists. Sarah knew none of this. She just looked through the scope, found that quiet place again, and fired. Another perfect hit. This time, the officials weren't just surprised. They were genuinely amazed. One of them, a general from the British Army, asked Captain Rodriguez where they had found this woman. He wanted to know about her background, her training, her experience. Rodriguez had to admit he didn't know anything about her. She was just a journalist who had shown up that morning to write a story. Word spread quickly through the base. Soldiers started gathering at the range, curious to see what was causing all the commotion. Sergeant Chen suggested they move to the extreme long-range section of the facility. This was where elite snipers practiced shots beyond 1,500 meters. These were distances where success required not just skill, but also perfect conditions and specialized knowledge. Chen wanted to see just how far Sarah's natural ability extended. They drove to a different part of the base, where the terrain opened up into a vast, flat expanse. The targets here were barely visible to the naked eye. Small shapes shimmering in the distance through the heat waves rising from the ground. Sarah felt nervous for the first time since she had fired that first shot. This seemed impossible. These distances seemed too far for anyone, let alone someone who had picked up a rifle for the first time an hour ago. But Sergeant Chen was patient. She explained more now, teaching Sarah about wind compensation and bullet drop. Sarah listened carefully, absorbing the information like a sponge. It all seemed to make intuitive sense to her, as if she had known these things somewhere deep in her mind and was only now remembering them. Chen showed her how to read the mirage through the scope, how to gauge wind speed by watching the grass and dust. The first target at this new range was set at 1,800 meters. Sarah took her time now, feeling less rushed, more focused. She watched the environment, noted the gentle breeze from the west, adjusted her aim slightly to compensate. When she fired, the wait seemed endless before they could confirm the hit. But when they did, it was another bullseye. The crowd of soldiers that had gathered broke into spontaneous applause. By now, the base commander had arrived. Colonel Patricia Hayes was a stern woman with 30 years of military experience. She had heard the reports coming from the range and had come to see for herself. She watched Sarah make 2 more shots at 2,000 meters, both hitting their marks. The colonel pulled Sergeant Chen and Captain Rodriguez aside. Speaking to them in low, urgent tones, Sarah sat up from the shooting position, finally taking a break. Her shoulder was sore from the rifle's recoil, and her head was starting to ache from the intense concentration. Soldiers approached her, asking questions, wanting to know her secret. Sarah had no answers for them. She didn't understand what was happening any more than they did. She just knew that when she looked through that scope, everything made sense in a way that nothing else in her life ever had. Colonel Hayes approached Sarah directly. She asked if Sarah would be willing to attempt one more shot. The longest shot in the base's current setup was 2,950 meters, nearly 3 kilometers. Only a handful of snipers in the entire military had ever successfully hit a target at that distance. It required perfect conditions, perfect equipment, and perfect execution. Hayes wanted to see if Sarah's incredible natural ability extended even to this extreme range. Sarah looked out at the target in the far distance. She could barely see it, even with her excellent natural vision. It was just a tiny speck on the horizon, wavering in the heat shimmer, 2,950 meters, nearly 2 miles. The distance seemed impossible, absurd even. Every logical part of her brain told her she couldn't make this shot. But another part of her, a part she was only beginning to discover. It's whispered that maybe she could. Sergeant Chen set up the rifle with extra care. At this distance, everything mattered. The ammunition had to be perfect. The scope had to be precisely calibrated. Even the way Sarah positioned her body would affect the shot. Chen explained the challenges they faced. The bullet would be in the air for several seconds. It would drop significantly due to gravity. The wind could push it off course. Temperature and humidity would affect the bullet's flight path. There were so many variables that even computers struggled to calculate them all accurately. Sarah listened, but she didn't try to do the math in her head. She realized that wasn't how this worked for her, and she made her previous shots. She hadn't been calculating angles and wind speeds. She had been feeling them, sensing them in a way she couldn't explain with words. It was like the difference between reading about swimming and actually being in the water. The knowledge was in her body, not her mind. The crowd around them had grown to over 100 soldiers. News had spread throughout the entire base that something extraordinary was happening at the range. Off-duty personnel had rushed over to watch. Some were recording on their phones, though Colonel Hayes had already ordered that no footage could leave the base without official approval. This was still a classified military facility after all, even if something unprecedented was occurring. Sarah got into position one more time. The ground was harder here, rockier. She shifted slightly, finding a comfortable stance. The rifle felt familiar now, like an extension of her own body. She had only been holding it for a few hours, but it no longer felt foreign or intimidating. Through the scope, she could see the target, though it was small and indistinct at this incredible distance. Sergeant Chen crouched beside her, speaking quietly. She told Sarah not to feel pressured, that nobody expected her to make this shot. Even suggesting a civilian try it was irregular. It's probably against several regulations that Colonel Hayes was choosing to overlook. Chen said that Sarah had already done something amazing today, something that would be talked about for years. There was no shame in missing this next shot. It was beyond difficult. It was nearly impossible. But Sarah wasn't thinking about failure. She was settling into that quiet space again, that place where only she and the target existed. She noted the wind, stronger now than it had been earlier. She felt the temperature on her skin, the way the air moved. She watched the mirage through the scope, reading patterns in the shimmering heat that she didn't consciously understand, but somehow knew how to interpret. Minutes passed. Sarah didn't rush. She waited for the perfect moment, for all the variables to align just right. The crowd grew silent, sensing the concentration required for what she was attempting. Even the other sounds of the base seemed to fade away. No vehicles moved. No one spoke. Everyone was holding their breath, watching this impossible moment unfold. Then Sarah felt it. The moment of perfect alignment. The wind paused for just a second. The mirage cleared slightly. Her heartbeat settled into its slowest rhythm. She took a breath, let half of it out, held the rest. Her finger found the trigger and she began to squeeze, slowly, steadily. With no jerking motion that might throw off her aim, the rifle fired with its characteristic boom. The recoil pushed back against Sarah's shoulder, familiar now after dozens of previous shots. But this time felt different. This time Sarah knew in her bones that she had done everything right. The shot had been perfect. Whether the bullet would reach the target, whether all her instinctive compensations for wind and distance had been correct, that was now out of her hands. The bullet was flying through the air at supersonic speed, covering nearly 3 kilometers of distance. Everyone raised their binoculars and scopes. Tracking toward the distant target, the wait felt eternal. At this distance, it took several seconds for the bullet to travel. Sarah didn't look through the scope anymore. She just lay there, suddenly exhausted, feeling the weight of what she had just attempted crash over her like a wave. Her hands were shaking again. Her heart was pounding. The adrenaline that she had pushed aside during the shot now flooded her system. Then, from the crowd, someone shouted. Others joined in, their voices rising in excitement and disbelief. Sergeant Chen was looking through a high-powered spotting scope, her face showing an expression of pure shock, and turned to look at Sarah, who was still lying on the ground. Chen's voice was barely a whisper when she spoke, but in the sudden silence, Everyone could hear her words perfectly clearly. Sarah had hit the target. The celebration erupted spontaneously. Soldiers who had served for years, who had trained endlessly to improve their marksmanship, were cheering for a civilian woman who had walked onto their base that morning knowing nothing about weapons. It was impossible, yet they had all witnessed it with their own eyes. Sarah had made a shot at 2,950 meters with no training, no preparation, and no experience. She had done something that some career snipers would never achieve in their entire military service. Colonel Hayes was already on her phone, speaking urgently to someone at the Pentagon. Captain Rodriguez stood nearby, looking completely overwhelmed by the situation. This had started as a simple publicity assignment, showing a reporter around the base for a feel-good story. Now it had turned into something that would require official reports, investigations, and probably a lot of difficult conversations with superior officers about how this had been allowed to happen. Sarah finally stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her. Soldiers patted her on the back, congratulated her, asked her questions she couldn't answer. She felt disconnected from reality, as if she was watching this happen to someone else. This morning, she had been worried about getting good quotes for her article. Now she had apparently demonstrated a level of marksmanship ability that defied explanation. She didn't understand it. She couldn't explain it. It had just happened. Sergeant Chen pulled Sarah aside, away from the excited crowd. She told Sarah that what had just happened was extraordinary, possibly unprecedented. Natural talent existed in marksmanship, of course. Some people had better hand-eye coordination, steadier nerves, sharper vision. But what Sarah had demonstrated went beyond normal natural talent. Chen had been teaching marksmanship for years, and she had never seen anything like this. Not even close. Colonel Hayes finished her phone calls and approached Sarah directly. She explained that there would need to be an investigation, not because Sarah had done anything wrong, but because the military needed to understand what had happened. They would want to test Sarah's abilities under controlled conditions. They would want doctors to examine her, to see if there was some physical explanation for her extraordinary performance. Hayes assured Sarah that none of this was mandatory, that Sarah was a civilian and could walk away if she wanted to. But Sarah found that she didn't want to walk away. Something had awakened in her today, something she hadn't known existed. For the first time in her life, she had found something she was genuinely exceptional at, something that made her feel alive and focused and capable. Her journalism career was fine, comfortable even, but it had never made her feel the way she had felt looking through that scope, making those impossible shots. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Sarah took a leave of absence from her newspaper, telling her confused editor that something unexpected had come up. She underwent batteries of tests at military medical facilities. Doctors examined her eyes, her nervous system, her cognitive processing. They found that Sarah had excellent vision and good reflexes, but nothing that would explain her marksmanship abilities. She was healthy and fit, but not superhuman. The doctors were as puzzled as everyone else. Sarah also began actual training with Sergeant Chen. If she was going to explore this newfound ability, she needed to do it properly. Chen taught her everything about long-range shooting, all the technical knowledge that Sarah had somehow bypassed with pure instinct. Sarah absorbed it eagerly, finally understanding the science behind what her body had been doing naturally. The training made her even better, combining her natural talent with professional knowledge. Stories about her achievements spread through military circles, though official channels kept it quiet from the public. Other marksmanship instructors came to watch her shoot to see if the reports were exaggerated. They weren't. Sarah could consistently make shots that would challenge expert snipers, and she had only been training for weeks. Some instructors were excited by her abilities. Others were skeptical or even resentful that a civilian could perform at such a level. Colonel Hayes called Sarah into her office after a month of training and testing. She got straight to the point. The military wanted to offer Sarah a position, not as a regular soldier. It would take too long and wasn't really appropriate for someone of Sarah's age and background. Instead, they wanted her as a civilian specialist, attached to special operations units that might need her unique abilities. It was an unusual arrangement, but Sarah was an unusual case. Sarah sat in Hayes's office, considering the offer. It would mean leaving her journalism career behind at least temporarily. It would mean entering a world she had never imagined being part of. It would mean danger, risk, and challenges she couldn't fully anticipate. But it would also mean pursuing this incredible ability she had discovered, pushing it to its limits. Seeing what she was truly capable of achieving, she thought about that first morning, walking nervously onto the military base with her notebook and camera, expecting nothing more than a routine assignment. She thought about how it had felt to look through that scope and discover something extraordinary about herself. She thought about the choices that had led her here, and the choice she now faced about where to go next. Sarah accepted the position 3 days later. The paperwork was extensive, the background checks thorough, and the security clearances complicated. But within 2 months, she was officially attached to a special operations unit as a civilian marksmanship specialist. It was an unprecedented arrangement, but then again, Sarah's abilities were unprecedented. The military had decided that her talent was too valuable to ignore. Even if it meant bending some traditional rules, her first real assignment came 6 months after that day on the range. A hostage situation in a foreign country, a mission that required long-range precision that even the unit's trained snipers weren't confident about. The shot required was over 2,000 meters, through difficult terrain with variable winds. Sarah was flown in quietly, briefed on the situation, and given her assignment. She was terrified, excited, and determined all at once. When the moment came, Sarah found that same quiet place she had discovered on the training range. The fear disappeared. The pressure faded away. There was only her, the rifle, and the target. She made the shot, and 3 hostages went home to their families. The mission was classified, so no one outside a small circle would ever know what Sarah had done. But she knew, and that was enough. Over the next 2 years, Sarah went on 7 more missions. Each one tested her abilities in different ways. Desert conditions, mountain terrain, urban environments. She learned to adapt her natural talent to every situation. Sergeant Chen remained her mentor and friend, helping her continue to develop her skills. The 2 women formed a bond built on mutual respect and shared dedication to their craft. But success came with complications. Sarah struggled with the weight of what she was doing. Taking a shot on a training range was one thing. Taking a shot that would end someone's life, even to save others, was something entirely different. She saw a military psychologist regularly, working through the moral and emotional challenges of her work. There were nights when she couldn't sleep, replaying missions in her mind, wondering if there had been any other way. She also faced skepticism and jealousy from some military personnel. They had trained for years, even decades, to achieve a level of skill that Sarah had simply been born with. Some saw her as a valuable asset. Others saw her as an outsider who didn't deserve her position. Sarah learned to ignore the criticism and focus on her work, but it wasn't always easy. She missed the simpler days of journalism, when her biggest worry was meeting a deadline. Yet, despite the challenges, Sarah found a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. She was using her unique ability to save lives, to make a difference in situations that would otherwise end in tragedy. Every successful mission reinforced her belief that discovering her talent that day hadn't been random chance. It had been destiny, or fate, or simply the universe revealing something about her that had always been there, waiting to be found. 3 years after making that first impossible shot, Sarah was invited to speak at a special military conference about unconventional talent identification. She stood before an audience of high-ranking officers and training specialists, telling her story. She talked about the importance of recognizing ability in unexpected places, about not being limited by traditional assumptions about who could or couldn't perform certain tasks. During her speech, Sarah reflected on how one random assignment had changed her entire life. If her editor had sent a different reporter that day, if Captain Rodriguez had refused Sergeant Chen's unusual request, if Sarah herself had said no to holding that rifle, her life would have continued on its comfortable, predictable path. She would still be writing newspaper articles, drinking her morning coffee, living a perfectly fine but unremarkable life. Instead, she had discovered something extraordinary about herself. She had found a talent so rare and valuable that it had opened doors she never knew existed. She had faced challenges she never imagined confronting, and she had risen to meet them. The journey hadn't always been easy, and she knew there would be more difficult days ahead. But standing at that podium, looking at the faces of people who had dedicated their lives to military service, Sarah felt grateful for the unexpected path her life had taken. After the conference, a young female officer approached Sarah. She thanked her for the speech and admitted that she had been considering leaving the military because she felt she wasn't good enough. Hearing Sarah's story had inspired her to keep trying, to believe that everyone has hidden strengths waiting to be discovered. Sarah smiled and told her the truth. She hadn't known she was capable of anything special until someone gave her the chance to find out. That evening, Sarah sat alone in her quarters, cleaning her rifle out of habit. It was a ritual that had become meditative for her, a quiet time to reflect on her journey. She thought about the journalist she had been, nervous and uncertain on that military base 3 years ago. She thought about the specialist she had become, confident in her abilities but humble about their source. Mostly, she thought about the future, about the missions yet to come, and the lives she might still save. Sarah Mitchell had been given a sniper rifle just to hold. And in that moment, everything had changed. She had made an impossible shot that stunned everyone who witnessed it. But more importantly, she had discovered the person she was meant to become. Her story was proof that sometimes life's greatest opportunities come disguised as ordinary moments, and that the most extraordinary abilities can be hidden inside the most ordinary people waiting for the right moment to emerge.